Hello, welcome back to the studio. Today, a seascape inspired by the Bob Ross classic, Surf's Up. First, we'll paint a vibrant sky with soft glowing clouds. Next, shape dynamic ocean waves full of energy. Then build a sandy beach with rugged rock details. And finish the waves with some lovely foam and glints to make it really pop. There's lots to do, so time to dive in. The jokes don't get any better, I'm afraid. So here's my canvas for today's painting. It's a 12 by 16, and of course I'm using one of my DIY paper canvases. I've got it taped to a regular canvas, so I've still got that nice little bounce in it. It's covered with two coats of a pale grey colour, sort of a neutral grey colour, just to seal up the surface because we're painting with oil paints for this entire painting. I also noticed I put a piece of tape on there. This is 5 inches at the top, 7 inches at the bottom. So really there isn't as much cloud in the background and there's more focus on maybe the wave. In Bob's original painting, he did all the sky on this Bob Ross liquid white oil paint. He used this to apply a thin even coat to the background sky so he could blend these colours directly onto the canvas. But if you don't have something like this, you could always use a little bit of linseed oil and then add some titanium white over the top. Don't add too much though. This background sky wants to be just oily and not too wet. So let's apply a thin even coat of this first. Because I'm using a smaller canvas, I'll also be using some slightly smaller brushes. These are just sort of a 1/2 inch and a 3/4 inch bristle brush. Take a small amount of my liquid white. I want to apply this very, very thinly. And if you've seen me doing this before, you already know that the way to test your canvas is to use your fingerprints. Now then, before I carry on, let's do a little test. I just use my fingertips, just touch into that paint. You can see I have a nice clear fingerprint. You can see all the little ridges on my fingerprints. If it looks a little bit like that, then there's not quite enough. And if it looks a little bit more like it's been dipped in ice cream, well, that's obviously too much. So we want just a thin, even coat. I'll do this section later on. And of course, I'll use my fingertips again, just to check. There, just about right. Not too much, not too little. Now, let's have a quick look at our palette. So here's my palette so far. And you see, I haven't set out all my colours. There's still a few gaps to fill. I'm going to use that same brush that I applied the liquid white with, and I've given it a good dry clean on a piece of paper towel. I'm going to go straight into a little bit of this lovely phthalo blue colour. Now, this is a really bright, sparkly blue tone, perfect sort of tropical sea, so maybe not quite the right colour for my painting. I might tint this with a little bit of Prussian blue just to cool things down a little. You see, I always start in my corners. I would like it, if it's going to be stronger, I'll have it in the corners, and I'd like it to sort of fade to the horizon line a little bit. If you're outside on a nice sort of sunny day, you'll often see the sky directly above you is dark, deep blue colour. And as your eyes drop to the horizon line, if you can see the horizon, you'll notice it gets very, very pale indeed, sometimes almost just pale white. So we want to be able to mimic that same effect with our painting. I'm using Bob's painting, his original painting, Surf's Up, as inspiration, but I'm doing it in a slightly different order. I've painted it the way Bob did it, and I have to say, I found it quite tricky. I have to admit that it wasn't really quite my cup of tea. And I think that's really the thing to remember when you're painting, is that we don't always have to paint exactly the same way someone else did it. You can look at something and say, I want to change it. And it is that sort of freedom of expression that I think that Bob really wanted everybody to be able to do, to actually look at something and say, I like it, I'm inspired, but I'm doing it my way. And here you see the beauty of using the liquid white. I'm able to spread my colour and let it fade. Without the liquid white, I'd still be up here in the corners fighting to get this paint to move. And if it's too dark up here, I can pick up a little bit of the blue colour. I can move it somewhere else in my painting. But every time you reload your brush, folks, don't forget, always start up in those corners first. But you don't want a really big, dark, navy blue blob of paint right in the middle of our sky. And I like to just sort of show you what I think would be a great way to learn to paint. But you make your own mind up. I wouldn't say I want a stormy sky, but maybe I want a sky with a little bit more mood to it. Now, this is a very bright, lovely, shiny colour, very, very warm, and Prussian blue is a cool blue colour. So if I mix the two together, I should get somewhere in between, sort of warm but not cold. And as you see, I put a little bit of that on there. See how it changes the look of my sky? If I put just a little bit on just say one corner, you can compare the two. This is bright and sparkly. That is a definite cool colour. And I think again, when we're learning to paint, we tend to hear lots of expressions like warm tones and cool tones. And it doesn't always necessarily make much sense. What exactly are people talking about? Well, in my sort of very basic sense, a warm colour is one that you would think of being like tropical. It would make you feel really happy. It's a bright and sunny colour. Whereas something which is cool, maybe more of a sort of a winter tone. So it just depends on what you're painting, the tone of the sky. As you see, I've done it with a couple of little streaks across there. You can just add this little bits of fun in here. And I'm going to have a nice big cloud over on this side. So I'm not going to worry about this side too much, but this side I wanted just to cool it down and to just add a little bit more interest. Now, let's mix up some colour. I think I need a nice shadow colour, which is going to be a nice lavender tone. Whenever I think of mixing lavender tones, my go-to colours are always some phthalo blue and some alizarin crimson. But you have to be careful because the phthalo blue is a bit of a bully and it'll want to take over the entire painting. So I'm going to use mainly alizarin crimson. This is a good amount of that. I'm going to start off with a bit less of the phthalo blue, probably about 5:1 ratio, and even that might be too much. Mix this really well and see what colour you get. And we're looking for sort of a nice mid-lavender colour. Well, as you see, the first mix gets me sort of some way towards it. It's definitely a little bit more purpley, but I think I want a little bit more. And there you see, just a little tiny bit extra. Suddenly I've got a nice purple tone for my painting. And I can tint this a little more with some Prussian blue to cool it down. You can add a little tiny drop of black into it just to change the value, but I'm going to stick with this just for the time being. Now, let's think about doing some planning. Now we know that the light is going to come from this part of my painting. We know that the right-hand sides of my cloud are going to be a little brighter and the areas to the back of them are going to be a little more in shadow. Now, to design my clouds on my canvas, I'm going to use my palette knife, no paint on it, and I'm just going to scratch with the tip of the knife. Remember, we want to think about the layers of these clouds. Maybe do the background layer first. So I'll do this and I'll just scratch this on with the tip of my knife. That'll be bright here and shadow back here. And maybe we'll add a second layer that sits inside the first shape. And then finally maybe that ball shape somewhere in here. So you see I've got sort of 3 layers of cloud. And you can shift these backwards and forwards to wherever you want. The nice thing is if you don't like the design you scratched on there, just use your little brush and you can brush it out and you can have another go. And maybe we'll just put the other piece of cloud back in here. I hope you can see that because it's just very faint, but let's actually start by putting on some colour. Maybe we'll start by putting on the shadow colour first. My brushes for this painting are all a little bit smaller than ones I would normally use for a big canvas. A couple of Bob Ross fan brushes. Whoops. This is one of a fan brush that I cut down and turned into my own little dagger brush. A couple of filberts and a little round brush and another little flat brush. But you use whatever size brushes you need. I'm probably going to start off by using these 2 brushes. These are for just adding some shadow and some highlights. As I mentioned, I'm probably going to go with putting the shadow colours in first. And I'm going to go into my lavender colour. Say this is quite a bright lavender. I don't know what it's going to look like on my painting just by looking at the palette. So let's put some of this on the canvas and see what we've got. Now remember, the back of these clouds are all in shadow, so I want to just scrub some of this colour in first. And there's the edge of the little cloud that I'm going to be painting, so I don't have to be too sort of careful. You know, so I'm just going to scrub this colour in. Look, now here's that sort of blob of bright colour here in the foreground again. I'm just going to block in where I think that's going to be. So we've got our couple of layers of cloud. See, so I just made a little change there. I'm going to go for two nice little bits of cloud. And as I say, just keep it loose at this stage. We can always blend this in. I'll probably set this aside and keep it for some more shadow. Maybe I'll pick up a nice round brush, putting on some highlights. And I'm going to go into a little tiny drop of the titanium white for this. And get a reasonably good amount, because this colour will tone down quite quickly. You know, the light's coming from up here, so maybe we want to think about adding the bright side of our cloud just in here. And notice I'm using little circular strokes. C for cloud. As you see, just adding these little curls. I want this to come in here and just bump into my shadow colour. I can just start bringing these two edges together. And I'm going to come in here with a little bit of colour and do that other layer of cloud. Now, the next thing to do is to stand back from our painting, have a look at it from the other side of the room and see what we need to do about here, because this doesn't quite work, does it? This cloud is supposed to be under this cloud, and yet I have this very hard edge. This is a bit of an awkward angle as well, isn't it? It looks like it's been glued on. So we need to come back in here and maybe make a change. We'll do that in a second, but I need to do that stand back first. So as expected, I stand back and I see what you see, which looks like a funny shaped sort of ball here with some funny looking prongs on it and a cloud behind here that doesn't quite work. And I've done this really more because this is quite a common thing to have happen. You start on a painting, think, so well, it's all gone out of shape. It wasn't what I had in my mind. So I've still got my blue brush in here, so let's go back in and make some changes. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to really rub out this sort of hard line here between this cloud. Maybe move that line at the top so I've got more of a sort of an individual shape. And it doesn't take much, does it? Suddenly you can start moving your clouds around. You're going to sort of take that little bit of cloud away. Just go push into there and blend that out into the background sky. So very quickly, in just a matter of a few seconds here, I've just taken my bristle brush here and I've just literally knocked everything about. And I do this with a little confidence because, as you might have guessed, this isn't the first time this has ever happened to me, that I sit there looking at these two really heavy fixed shapes and worry that I might change things too much or that I'm going to break things. Well, let me give you a top tip. I would rather break my clouds than sit there looking at them forlornly and wondering what I could do to fix them. I would rather do this, knock them about and then decide it was a mess and start over, than try and work with something which is really not inspiring. And instantly you see that by just kind of flattening that down and pushing it back and then letting this one come forward a little bit more, I maybe see a little bit more direction for my painting. Now then, I might just add a little bit of highlighting to here, but let's make this the focal point. And this is the reason why I don't always paint things maybe the right order. It's because I suspect probably we all paint things in slightly a different order. That doesn't always kind of make life easy for ourselves. And I just sort of lose that edge there. See, so that piece of cloud there looks like it's curling around this little piece of shadow. Again, little curls, little flicks with the brush. That's the piece that's on top. It's a little brighter. This is the piece at the back, a little bit more in shade. And maybe we could have another little piece of cloud in here. Again, a little less distinct. So what do you think of my first shape there? Still looks good. Doesn't look quite right maybe. Make some small changes to it. If they're a little bit too hard, then you could always take a nice soft fan brush and just soften them up a little bit. But again, don't knock out all that lovely detail that we didn't have to work too hard to create. For this, I'm going to use just some of that lavender colour. I say these are a long, long way away. I don't really want them to be too sort of bold, more sort of literally backdrop. And I'll let this colour just blend into the canvas and just let them sort of become little stringy background clouds. And again, a couple of layers of little clouds. Take them off the edge of the canvas so they look like they're blowing in from the side. And there we go. I think my background sky is pretty much done. Remember, this is a seascape. That's where I'm going to work next. Now don't forget, before we move on to the water, remove the tape. In Bob's original painting, he did this entire lower section with liquid clear, but I'm actually going to be using liquid white for the top and the bottom. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to use my old brush to apply it. It's got a little bit of blue in it, but well, it doesn't really matter. It'll just tint my water a nice colour. And once again, finish off with some nice long brush strokes. And then of course, the little fingertip test again. There, that's much better. Now, let's do a little sketch of our wave. I'm going to take just a small amount of this dark Prussian blue colour. Just a little bit is all I really need. Now, whenever I lay out a seascape, the one thing I always want to know is where is the eye of the wave? It's such a focal point. I don't want to squeeze it too far up to one side, too close to the horizon line, squashed over there or squashed down here on the beach. So if you can see where the eye of the wave is going to be, then you can sort of work away from it. We'll come back to the balance of this painting and composition in just a moment, but if you remember, we have a thing called the rule of thirds. So if you come across the canvas about the third way across and about a third up from the bottom, it brings you to a little area here, very much in that little section there. And that is such a draw for the eye that I wouldn't mind having that as the eye of my wave. My eye is drawn to it, and from there I can work everything away. Now, I'm going to draw the shape of my wave, and it's going to have a very classic sort of shape to it. This is the wave as it's starting to build up. This is the wave as it crashes over, and that's the eye of the wave. And then to the left of it here we have what looks like a saddle. And this is where the wave is crashing over onto a beach. So very quickly you can see that I've got the essential elements of my painting laid in. I've allowed some room on the end here for some nice rocks for the wave to crash against. And the other important line I like to put in is the beach line, or the base of the wave. And if you're going to have a nice sort of perspective to this, it's helpful if this sort of falls away at a bit of a shallow angle. So if I just draw that in. So you see how the wave looks like it's building to this crashing part where it all kind of crashes over. So we've kind of got the wave shape already organised on our painting. We've got our rocks coming down onto a beach, and we've got the beach, and then we've got some background sea. By doing this, we won't run into too many problems later on with position. The eye won't be too far over to one side, and we won't sort of end up sort of out of position for a lot of things, or running out of room. In the background here, I can think about dropping in some little waves. And again, for perspective, we start off being fairly level to the horizon line, and as they come forwards, the angle will drop a little bit. So they're sort of like fanning out, like so. into the distance, things tend to get compressed together, so the little distant waves in here might be very close together. And as they come forwards, they're going to open up a little bit more. So again, we can vary the distances between waves so that we have a nice sort of graduation. So the perspective works from things quite sort of far apart, getting close together as they look towards the horizon line. This little shape is a classic. Make a note of it because it's going to be useful when you do your next seascape. Now we know where everything's going to be in our painting. Let's do some blocking in. I'm going to take some more of this Prussian blue colour. Probably take a good dab of that lavender colour with it as well. I want a good strong dark colour for my sea. Let's have a quick test on my canvas here. Yes, that works well. And again, I'm not going to try and keep all these little background lines, but you'll see as I block in my waves, I keep them looking nice and sort of rough and bumpy. Now, fairly flat off into the distance here. And I don't really try and sort of do too much about fixing things that may be a little out of line. I tend to find that, again, if you just let the brush do the work for you, and suddenly you start to see that the waves will actually form a great shape without you having to work too hard at it. As I say, I might lose some of the little details I sketched on there, but I can always find them again. And in here, the eye of my wave. And again, think about the shape of the water in here. Remember, it's fairly flat over here. And as it comes towards here, it's going to start to get steeper and steeper and steeper until it flops over, and that's the eye of the wave. So don't need a lot of paint in there, but you can see how I can quickly create the shape of my wave. That little blob there, that's going to become either a sailing boat or a bird. I haven't decided which yet, but anyway. I'm going to start working on the background waves first. Now, after 25 or more years of painting, I've amassed a few paintbrushes, lots of different sizes. I have synthetics and bristle brushes, and I just want something small. Now, you could use a Bob Ross liner brush to do this. Bob used to use it all the time, but I've got, I'd say, lots of different brushes I can choose from. So I prefer using something like a little flat filbert or even a small round brush. I don't really mind which. I think I'll probably use this little filbert for the time being. And I'm not going to use white paint. I'm going to mix up a colour that, if you've seen any of me doing seascapes in the past, you'll know it's a colour called Seascape White, and it's a little touch of yellow ochre and white. Doesn't matter if there's a little bit of blue in there, it doesn't matter at all. And this is white with a hint, and I'm talking about just a hint of ochre. And it was the suggestion of a lovely teacher from way back when, who said that she never painted her seascapes with white. She always did them with this colour. White with a hint of ochre. And I started doing it, and I've used that same little colour ever since. Now, you see I've got several different values of it here. And you may think, well, why don't I just use white? But somehow this looks brighter than white. Look at that, against that blue sky. That white with a little hint of yellow ochre in it, it really jumps off the canvas. And I even like to use this to come back and touch up a few edges on my sky. So watch out for that. And the other thing I've got is this thing. And this is called a marl stick. It's just a piece of wood with a hook on the end that I can hook around the end of my canvas. And I use my finger at the other end. And this just acts like a bridge that I can work along. A simple, even just a walking stick will do with just a piece of tape wrapped around it. Anything that you can hook around the canvas that you can use to steady your hand is very useful. So as you saw in that last little session, I just dropped in a few suggestions about these background waves, and then I stood back. Now, what would happen if you then looked at the reference photograph, the painting which is the inspiration, you thought, hang on, Bob's wave is a lot more in the centre, and mine's sort of down here. It needs to be sort of over here a bit more. Ugh, what can you do? Well, pick up your brush and paint this out. You see, sometimes we do get things in the wrong place. Sometimes we have these little happy accidents, but don't let it stop you from going back and making some changes. As I said, this has all been done on a canvas which has got liquid white on it, which means that I can rub things out and I can move them. Now, as long as your canvas is still wet, you can make all of these adjustments. As you see, I just rubbed out my wave and I'll draw it back in again, and then I can start over, but with the main wave in a new position. I'll do that next. I think what I'll do is I'll just drop in a little bit more colour into my background waves. There, didn't take long to get this back in shape. We can go back to our little detail brush, and again, just using some of this Seascape white colour, maybe I'll just pick out the tops of just a couple of little waves here. And these don't have to be absolutely straight, but that little falling angle, falling over to the right, really kind of helps our waves. So they're coming sort of towards us from the right hand side, from the distance into the foreground. I want to come back and work inside some of these little areas in here, adding a little more shade, a little more light into a few of these, giving these all a little bit more movement. Remember, we tend to have a little bit of shadow underneath the crests of these waves, and in the dips between waves, the water is fairly flat. It tends to act more like a mirror, so maybe a cloud could be reflected in some parts of this water. It's not too rough, it's fairly still, but we need to think about doing lights and darks, and then adding some foam to these little background waves, and that's what I'm going to work on next. So to get these waves looking a nice sort of shape, these little touches of white here, I'm actually going to use a small round brush. I think this might work better than that little flat brush. I just want to take some of this colour and just pull it back. Okay, so it looks as though we're sort of painting in the dip between these waves. Just pulling it back and giving it a little upward flick. So it looks like it's sort of following the direction of the water. It's following up into the wave in the background. Can you see that kind of shape I'm creating there? And you can do this on all of these waves. Just pull them back, give a little upward flick, and that now kind of starts to give you the shapes of some nice waves. Now let's get a little more paint. I think this little flat brush might work better for us. Has a little bit more paint. So this is the flat area between the waves. Here's the crest of a wave. These look like they're stacked one on top of the other, don't they? So maybe I'll just take a little bit of this wave off to one side. Again, still using just my Seascape white colour here. And notice I'll roll my brush along to give me a little bit more kind of a nice sort of roll to the paint. I don't want this to be too static, too straight. And again, I'll let this sort of taper off to the side here. And there you see, I made this wave stand out a little more by just introducing a little shadow line underneath the edge of these waves. Just tease it round. You can do this along all of your waves. You can make more of them stand out if you wish to. I suggest the ones in the background probably don't need as much differentiation. They don't need that deep shadow line. But as the waves come forward, like this one, he could do with a little bit of foam on him. In fact, making that area there a little darker is actually quite a good idea, because we've got a cascade to paint in here, and a little bit of dark water behind it is actually quite useful. But you'll see that in just a moment. We can come back and add a little more foam splash and crash to the top of that wave. There. And we can come back and we can detail this more and more and more. We can add more and more to it. But I want to start moving now onto the main wave. I want to work on the eye of the wave next. If, like me, you've had to do some little changes and you've moved your wave around and you've lost the eye of your wave, it doesn't really matter. As I say, the paint's still wet. And all I suggest you do is just take your finger and just wipe off some of the surplus paint. I actually didn't put too much paint on my canvas, so I can wipe the paint off and I can reshape this wave a little bit and remove any surplus paint. I'd advise you to do this on any seascape that you're working on. If you're going to try and put the eye of the wave in, is to remove any of that surplus heavy paint that's on there. And I'm just wiping my finger on a baby wipe, and it's just moist enough to actually make my finger damp. For the eye of my wave, I'm going to use a little tiny drop of titanium white and a little tiny drop of cadmium yellow colour. This colour wants to be sort of like a primrose yellow colour, so a very pale yellow. Don't get it too bright, because you're going to have to scrub this paint into the canvas. So there's my primrose yellow colour. Now the eye of the wave in here is transparent. In other words, the light coming through from the back and the water at the top of the wave is really thin and see-through. And I'm going to go just inside the line of my wave, so just come back in just a fraction. Sit your brush in there. This is going to be the brightest spot. And just give your brush a really firm push. I'm really pushing into the canvas here. You can hear me scrubbing the paint in. I really want to make sure this gets a really good contact. Now, as you're doing this, of course, you're going to be picking up colour. And what we don't want to do is keep going back to the very, very top. We want to be working away from the eye of the wave and down into here. And that way the eye of our wave stays nice and bright. Now you can carry on adding a little bit of brightness under the edge of this wave. If you pick up any colour, you can wipe some of it off. Pick up a little more. And you can extend some of this transparency along the crest of this wave. I'm going to just use a little 1/2 inch brush there just to soften that up a little bit. And here I'm just using the very corner of the brush, just doing a little twirl, just to blend my wave. Of course, if you're doing this on a bigger canvas, you'd be using something like a 1 inch brush, but the same technique applies. Just get it on a corner, a couple of little hairs, give it a little stir. The next section of my wave is this part, which is the bit where the wave tumbles over. And this is the reason why I wanted to put a little bit something a bit dark behind it, because the top edge of this should be catching the light. So I want that to be fairly bright. I'm going to use a fan brush for this, and it doesn't have to be perfectly clean white paint, just something fairly bright. Got a little bit of yellow ochre mixed into it. One tip I'm going to give you though is to make sure your brush is well loaded with colour. Now my paint is fairly stiff and it might not stick so easily, and if it does feel a bit on the dry and tacky side, then you can add just a speck of liquid clear to it, or even a tiny drop of odorless thinners, but only just enough to make it thin slightly. If it's too wet and runny, well, it won't stick properly. Now, can you see that little shadow line in there? We need to keep that because that's the shadow line that separates the foam on the edge of the wave from the eye of the wave. That's that little shadow line in there. I nicknamed it the mascara line, so it looks like it's the eye of the wave, and that's where the mascara goes. So we want to leave that little line in there and work on this little section at the back. So we need to leave a little bit of a gap. And the trick is to keep your brush nice and level, well loaded with colour, and you want to just come along as though you're walking along the top of this curve. And when you get to a nice sort of point, actually let the brush fall. And you're going to just let it fall until it just goes down into here, and then you're going to lift off with a little bit of a flourish. We want to save a little bit of shadow in here for the foam. So let's do our first stroke, and again, you've got to be a bit decisive with this. It's no good being too tentative. Push, get to here, off. We'll do it with a nice flourish and leave all these lovely scratchy lines behind. Reload your brush, get it into some nice shape, get it all nicely chiseled up again. And you want to come just beside it and then drop in again. So follow that line, lots of pressure, and off with a little flick. Another little press and flick. And by the time I come over into here, I don't really want it to be too bright. So I'm going to just let my brush run out of paint. And there you have it. It's the little bit where the wave rolls over. And if it's a little bit chunky in a couple of places, you can just gently overbrush. But I warn you, you can undo this lovely effect by going over it one too many times. And if the shadow line is lost a little bit, we can always put that back in. But I think I want to put some nice foam in there next. Now the keen-eyed amongst you will look at my painting and think, that looks a little bit different to the last time we saw it. Well, you see, somebody forgot to press record. They did all the lovely foam patterns on here. I looked at the camera and it wasn't switched on. I have these momentary lapses when the camera decides to go on a tea break. More often than not, it's my brain that goes to sleep. Okay, so I had to put the shadow back on again. Now then, we're going to use either a filbert brush or a fan brush to put the foam on. You decide what you like to work with best. I know the fan will get me a lovely pattern in here. It's a little bit big and maybe suited to a bigger painting, so maybe we'll go with the filbert brush. That's what I used last time, and I'll use it again. The colour doesn't have to be pure white. Off-white works just lovely. A little touch of yellow ochre mixed into it again. Pure white tends to be a little bit sort of too stark and a bit cold. And this is a very old filbert brush. It's a bit sort of reluctant to sort of make a nice sort of pattern, so I'm just going to press it into the paint and get some nice spiky edges to it. Now, the inside of this area here is called the mascara line, and if you look again at Bob's painting, you can see that lovely dark edge in there. Sitting behind it is the foam and the eye of the wave, so we need to keep that line visible. We're just putting the foam on, and look at all that lovely detail in there. We want to try and get that in our painting. So, using your filbert brush or fan brush, I'm going to just do some little circles here. It's a little bit like painting those cloud shapes. And you're just doing little touches, little circles, and pressing with the brush just to leave that nice little sort of bubbly edge. And when you come over the crest of the wave, you can give the brush a little bit of a push. See what happens, it creates these lovely little explosions. So it looks like the water really bursting off the edge. So I'm going to put a little bit more of a drop and a bit more of a dip in here and there. So you can just press into the paint. I like these little drooping edges. We'll make those little circles a little bit tighter. And here you see why I said to leave the shadow. It's the reason why there's a little bit of shadow in here as well. Because if I want to make this foam show up, I need something dark to make it show up against. And there's that little pushing stroke. You just go in with your brush and give it a little press. Look at that lovely explosion of paint. You have to do this with a little confidence, folks. So I know you might think, oh, I don't want to be too aggressive with my brush, but trust me, this is the one time when you can really use your brush. Do some nice little pressing strokes. And then back in here again, little tiny tight circles. There we go. A little push in there. So you see I've got that lovely foamy edge on there. We can come back and brighten this up if we need to. Second part of painting, the foamy parts of my painting, is to use just a few hairs on the corner of my little bristle brush here. And if you're doing this on a bigger canvas, you'll probably be using a 1-inch brush, but the technique is exactly the same. You're just using just a few hairs, a lot of hair, and you're just going to soften this up. But don't destroy all the lovely detail inside your wave. Bring this round into here. We want a lovely shadow line in here. Don't worry if you've lost yours, but you can put it back in. I'll add some back into mine. Put a little bit of a soft blend in here in places too. Running out of paint on my palette. Put in a few more details in here. And we can put the rocks and cover this area with a nice rock. There we go, a little bit of a blend. Now, don't forget, here's the floor of the wave, so you don't want your foam coming down any lower. That's it. Here is all going to be beach. So keep that in mind when you're doing the next stage of your wave. Don't come down too low. In Bob's original painting, he had this done as a wet beach, and he just used some of the sky colours and the light from the eye of the wave to do it. But I fancy to do something a little different again. I want to put a proper sort of nice sort of golden sandy beach on there. So I'm going to use one of these little bristle brushes and a little touch of the dark sienna. Now this paint is a little old now. It's getting a bit stiff and a bit dry. So this is probably the last outing for it. But I'm going to go into some of this dark sienna. I've got some Van Dyke brown, a little touch of black. And I'm simply going to take some of this nice golden brown colour and just work it into the beach area. Now, when it hits the lavender there, it's going to turn a nice sort of dark blackish colour. But I do want this nice sort of sandy brown colour here first. And again, you don't really need to do this particularly neatly. Remember, it's a nice dark sandy beach, so we want this to look like a little bit speckly. So as I hit into that little bit of lavender colour there, it's going to start to darken up. You see, we get some of these little dark edges in here. That's okay, because I actually want this water to look like it's sort of a bit more shadow in it. Again, just scrubbing this colour on, blend these edges together. You can see my dark sienna starts to be lost, so you've got to be careful here, because you can end up turning everything sort of this a muddy brown colour. I just dry cleaned the brush that I did the beach with, and I picked up some more of that lovely primrose colour. And I've loaded my brush quite well with this. Don't be too mean with it. And what we want to think about is how this colour would be reflected down across the beach. And I'm just going to just touch and just pull down and create some nice bright bands of colour here. And again, don't overwork it, because I guarantee if you go over it more than once or twice, it will end up disappearing. Now, it's probably a bit bigger than it needs to be, but I think it's going to work okay. I just wipe my brush off on a piece of paper towel and just gently brush this across. And we can see we get this nice sort of, looks like light hitting a nice wet beach here. And I'm just using the side of my brush, just gently sweeping across and pulling backwards and forwards with it. You see, just like magic, we create this lovely wet beach look without having to work too hard at it. These edges look a little bit sharp, don't they? I might have to just go over those edges just a couple more times, just to kind of lose them a little bit. That's it, pull a little bit of that dark colour in here at the edges. With a little bit of practice, you can get some really lovely effects. Now, I'm going to use my palette knife for the next section. Bob used a fan brush when he did his, but I think I use a palette knife. I prefer it. Pick up a little roll of that paint. I just dropped my little bit of primrose colour in there into that paint just to get a bit of a shine to it. And I'm going to use my knife and I'm going to just do some little zigzag strokes. Now, this does take some practice to get your finger on the back of the knife. And we're working sort of from left to right. And what we're doing is we're sort of working from here over into that part of the wave. But just remember, you can sort of work away, but you can't start high and work back. You have to work away from the wave. So bearing in mind, we're going to have a nice rock in here, and we're going to go in with a nice little bit of pressure. and we're going to press on that knife. See how I lean on it? What happens is we're actually squeezing the roll of paint out to the tip of the knife. There we go, got a nice bright edge there to line up with our light on the beach. Another little roll of paint. And you can just zigzag backwards and forwards and work down and then work across again. Zigzags, and across again. Now, I don't mind if you use that brush to pull back, you can, but just these little back edges here, grab them and pull them back down the beach. See that lovely wet look again? And that's your sort of first surf line there. If you want to, you can go back over this and you can soften a few edges here. And you can add more surf into here, which is what I'm going to do next. And remember that this is all on a flat level beach. You don't start going up into the wave until you're really much closer to the base of it, which is back in there somewhere. There's always a tendency to want to start going up into the wave too soon. This sort of doesn't quite match. Remember, all of these lines on here are all coming down and along like so. This one in here comes right into the base of there. So none of this is actually touching the wave. It's all a little bit further away in the painting. I'll do a little bit more work on this area. For the detailing in this part of my wave, keep in mind that this actually is all in shadow. It's only really over in here, which you actually might get some light on the beach. So the light is actually from here and everything behind it is in shadow. So those details on the wave, they don't need to be that bright. I'm going to use just this little flat filbert brush again. Take a little bit of the white colour, get a little bit of this lavender colour. And again, just tone it down, a little bit of Prussian blue. There we go. It's a more of a grey sort of colour. I think would work quite well. And again, remember the shape of this wave. I drew those little lines on there, didn't I, to remind us that as the wave is coming across, it's slowly building steeper and steeper. Now, you can do exactly what Bob did on his wave painting, which is to simply have lots of lovely streaks going up. And that looks great. Or you can do something a little more complicated, because waves do have sort of like little sort of wiggles and squiggles in them, but they are all attached to the face of the wave or to the shape of the wave. So you can't go too abstract with these. These have all got to still sort of follow the general pattern and shape of the wave, but I leave it up to you how much of this you want to do or not. But I do know that it's good fun. Do a little bit of time lapse through here and you'll see me adding lots of little details to my painting. You saw in that last little sequence, I just put a little bit of light on top of some of these waves. Again, it's the Seascape white with a tiny drop of yellow ochre, so this is all sort of tied together. And you can see how I put some little effects on the beach here and took those up into the waves, a little bit of shadow in the eye of the wave, and of course I restored the mascara line a little more, and I even added a little bit of Seascape white to my clouds, just to tie the whole painting together so that you don't have sort of isolated blocks of colour. The other thing Bob had on his painting is some lovely rocks. I've got some Van Dyke brown and some black. I'm just going to mix those together to give me a nice sort of dark colour to underpaint my rocks with. And there's a nice big rock here on the side. Again, just press this down into the canvas. And I like using a palette knife for this because it's a nice sort of hard edge to things. You can get some nice sort of shapes. Now, here's a top tip for you. When you add rocks to something like a seascape, if you've got the time, leave your seascape alone for maybe a day or two just to let the paint firm up. And you'll find that adding rocks is so much easier if you're not having to fight your way over a lot of wet colour. You can get it to sort of stick to your canvas a little easier. I don't have the luxury of time, so I'm just going to have to put this on and just press it down. But notice how rough I leave it. I don't actually try and get a particularly nice finish to it. I actually let some of the seascape come through. I actually quite like the fact that that actually looks like some of the lavender colours coming through. Now, I might also have another little rock in here somewhere. It might be a bit crowded. Maybe I'll hold off on that one. But I do know that I want something to balance up my painting again. The composition, it's nice to have, say, 3 points of interest. So you have clouds, I have wave, and then something else. So your eye has somewhere to travel. So maybe a bravery test. We'll put a nice rock here. Let's see. It is a bravery test, and if you do it and don't like it, it's going to be tricky to get rid of. But see how that kind of lends a nice sort of balance to my painting now. And again, I don't worry about picking up some of the surf. If I pick up some of that colour, it's okay. I'll just work it into my rock. There we go. To highlight those rocks, we need a nice marble mixed colour. And Bob uses a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of yellow ochre, all sorts of things thrown together, a little bit of dark sienna with it, all works well. You decide what you fancy for your particular painting. I'm just going to use some dark sienna, a little ochre, a little touch of red maybe, just for fun. It gets us a nice orangey kind of colour. Touch of white. That's a bit of a dog's dinner, isn't it? We'll take a little of this colour, just a tiny bit on the edge of the knife. Again, the light coming in from the side here, so we just want to kind of catch the edge of our rocks. Super light touch. Try and keep my hand out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. But I'm just letting the knife touch where it wants to touch, leave some paint where it wants to leave paint. Try and think about the rock not being just a one big chunk, but maybe being in several chunks. So it might be sort of weathered and worn. And again, this little rock, again, super light touch. Super light touch. Again, I just play with the colours I've got. A little bit more white into this mixture, a little bit more ochre. And I continuously adjusting my colours as I go and applying it to my painting and then having a look at it and seeing if I like it. I think this could be just a tiny bit brighter in a couple of spots. Yeah, let's see, I like that. Got a little touch of yellow on my palette knife. Again, sometimes you can get away with putting colours in which aren't really kind of the right colour. A bit like that little patch of yellow on there. It shouldn't really work, but sometimes you find that just including some colours which are not what I would call a local colour or not the colour that you would expect to see, somehow it can kind of lift a painting. It's quite amazing how it happens. I'm just mixing up a little bit of phthalo blue, cad yellow, yellow ochre, a little touch of white, get kind of a turquoisey colour. One of my favourite colours for putting on rocks is a little touch of turquoise. And again, you can just drop some of this into the back of the rock just to make it look a little more sort of three-dimensional. but I leave that up to you how much of that you want to do. But my top tip is that the best rocks you paint are the ones you only paint once. If you go over and over and over them too many times, they just end up kind of being mushy. So I'm going to play with these just a little tiny bit more. I think I need some reflections from them. As you saw in that last little sequence, I couldn't resist adding a few more little highlights on there. I included a little dark rock there. He's more in the shadows. I might not even highlight him. And of course, I grabbed a little colour and turned it into reflections. And don't forget, if you've got some light on here, you want that little bit of light showing in your reflections. It's a neat touch, but again, it just increases the quality of your painting. I did the same on here. I just put a little bit of colour into my reflection, but they need a little waterline around them. So I'm going to use the small blade of my palette knife. And again, I've got some white. You see, it's pretty grubby now. I got a little tiny touch of white, Seascape white. And just remember that the waterlines sort of just tuck in around the base of these rocks. And you don't have to be particularly big and bold with them. Just a little touch of light here and there is all they need, just to kind of settle the rocks down into the beach. And see, that works perfectly. You don't need to do too much more to it. And I'm going to give this a little tiny touch of a waterline as well. I might even have that little waterline coming from around the other side of that rock. Yeah, there we go. See, it kind of just sits the rock down into the water. And if I need a waterline for this side, I'm going to make sure that it's done in grey, so that that little waterline there isn't bright. It just goes literally light round into shadow. Again, you've got to be thinking about these things, where the light comes from when you do your painting, that not all the lighting in your painting has to be intense and bright, but you need to think about lights going into darks. The same in here, that the bright colours on my beach turn into grey colours up into here. Small touches, little details that really elevate your painting from being just a nice painting to being something a little better. And I hope that you've kind of got some little tips and ideas about painting seascapes from watching me do this little seascape based upon one of Bob's original paintings, Surf's Up. The last little thing I might do is just add a few little speckles of extra pop and splash on my wave because they look a little bit under. Before you tell me off for not having any seagulls in my painting, let's add a couple. Just got some Seascape white on my brush, and remember that I'm not a great fan of doing McDonald birds. I like to do what I call little crossed eyebrows. There you go, like a little eyebrow where they crisscross over. You get sort of like the head and the body all in one, and they like to sort of wheel around the sky. Paint odd numbers, 3s, 5s, 7s, and they're quite pale. So what I like to do is to pick up a little tiny drop, and all I'm using here is I'm just using a liner brush and a little drop of linseed oil mixed with some of my colours. It might be a bit pale, I'm not sure. Get a little bit more blue-grey colour. I just put a little bit of a shadow on their wings, just on their tips, just to give them a little bit of extra colour. There we go. It just makes them stand away from the background a little more. And if you do one that you don't like, you think sort of like, I don't like the look of him, he's sort of not quite what I imagined he should be, turn him into a cloud and we can have another go. Let's put the shadow on first. Let's do a little bit of a shadow colour. So he might be quite a nice colour if he's all in shadow. Well, everything has to be in white, but now I've got a little shadow on there. Let's put a little bit of light on him too. So there we go. 3 little seagulls. I'll play around with them and move them around a little bit, but I hope that gives you an idea of how to finish off your painting. So there you have it, a lovely seascape for you to tackle next. But don't move. Coming up, there's some more lovely videos to keep you inspired. And if you want to, you can leave a little like, a subscribe, and leave a comment for me too. You can even buy me a coffee, and I'll sit beside the sea and drink it. No, I won't. I spend it all on paint and brushes. Happy painting, people. Till next time.